Good, colleagues. We now gives me pleasure to start the fourth evidence session of our inquiry on the EU landing obligation, and I just would remind only our witnesses here that this is a live recording on webcast and a public meeting, as is obvious. We will be transcribing the dialogue, and we will send you a copy of that, and if there's anything that you feel is not right in terms of accuracy, then please come back to us. I would also say if during this session you feel there's areas we haven't sufficiently covered or there's additional evidence that you want to give, please, you're very welcome to do that in writing and send it to Alex, our clerk. Perhaps I could start there's no necessity for members that have spoken before to declare their interest. That's already been done, but I will declare myself as a board member of the Marine Management Organisation. Perhaps I could ask our panel, our witnesses, just to introduce themselves briefly. Helen, perhaps we could start with you.
Hi, yes, hello, Helen McLachlan. I'm the Fisheries Programme Manager at WWF UK.
Thank you. And Samuel.
Samuel Stone, heading up the Fisheries and Aquaculture team at the Marine Conservation Society. And in a previous life, I did work for the Australian fishing industry, running some gear improvement trials. So have some. Okay, well, I hope you have some opportunity
to give us some experience of that, indeed. Perhaps I could start off and just ask a very fundamental question in terms of why is the implementation of the landing obligation important as far as the broader marine environment is concerned? Or maybe it isn't. Maybe there's things that are far more important. Perhaps you could let us know. Either of you, whichever wants to take the question.
I'm happy to kick off.
Please do.
I mean, it's been a number of years ago since we had to make all these sort of statements in terms of the need for the landings obligation, but fundamentally at the bottom of it was about the wastefulness that has been part of fishing to date, and I think has been revealed to be the case, where we were really wasting very large amounts of fish and indeed other non-target resources in our fisheries, and we came to the understanding that actually we need to be much more selective in what we're removing from our oceans, because of course the impact of fishing is not just directly on the stocks that we target, but also on the non-target species that come up in some of the more unselective gear types, so ranging from benthic species, which form part of very complex habitats on the seabed, through to simply other non-target species for that which you have quota for. So you end up, fishing out large parts of those stocks as well. And, the data on the health and well-being of stocks has not been good, although the CFP, more recently in European waters, has helped to turn that around, I think. But for the general health and well-being of our marine systems, it's really important that we are aware of what we're removing, and that what we're removing is done on the most sustainable basis possible, and that means fishing as selectively as possible and with as minimum an impact on that system, because as we're aware, you've probably heard, it is under extreme stresses as we move forward, climate change of course being the biggest one of those. So in terms of the things that humans can do, fishing is one of the biggest areas that we can actually take some effective action. Okay,
thank you. Did you wish to add anything, Mr. Stone?
I think there are a few other reasons why an effective discard ban is very important for the marine environment. I think one of the most striking reasons is that without a discard ban, we essentially don't have firm catch limits. So at the moment and to date, we have quotas, but that's for what a fisherman can land. There's nothing to stop fishermen catching fish outside their quota and throwing them away. In fact, they're forced to throw them away. So right away you can see, I think most people would agree that having catch limits is a fundamental part of managing a fishery. But right away we can see that there's a mismatch. And there are other limitations, like a vessel size, its engine power, the gear, and the weather. And in many cases the skipper doesn't want to catch fish that he can't sell. But In reality, there is no firm limit at the moment, and a discard ban introduces a firm limit because it means that you have to have quota for what you're catching and you have to land that. So I think that's a really important measure, but it has to be done the right way. And as Helen alluded to, I think another really important element of an effective discard ban is developing an accountability of what is actually being caught. So instead of knowing exactly what has been landed, we know exactly what has been caught. So what you've caught and what you've thrown away. Traditionally, the fish that's discarded has not been well recorded. It's got better over the last 10 to 15 years, but there is still a real issue in many fisheries, and scientists just don't know the proportion of discarding in a lot of fisheries. So this kind of measure will help get a handle on that. And now more than ever, we're hearing that responsive and adaptive fisheries management is very important, so it can react to things like climate change. And underpinning all of that, to be responsive and adaptive, you need very, very good data. So you need to have a very good handle on what's been caught and what's been thrown away.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've had some written evidence from the NFFO, which it's got a couple of graphs, which I must admit I'd never seen before, which tracked the sort of the amount of discarding over the last 20 years, and it shows a huge decrease over that time. So, I mean, I suppose the response to that might be, given the amount of management effort this requires, maybe we're already winning this battle, and we should just carry on doing what we're doing at the minute because actually it's working pretty well. I don't know. Is that something that you recognise in terms of that volumes of discards?
Well, I'd certainly recognise that it has reduced a lot in many, many fisheries, and that's very, very welcome. But I guess the waste and reducing the discarding is just one element of the discard ban, because there's still the issue of having firm catch limits and accountability. So I'd certainly recognise improvements have been made, but I would say that more can certainly be done.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree, and I think also, exactly as Sam said, it's very important for us to have the best available data so that we have the highest levels of confidence that we can when we then set quotas for the various species. And you know, we're just not there, and we're starting to see around the world other fisheries management regimes taking that approach and benefiting from that. So you know, we should be looking to that.
What are the best examples of that without going into detail, because we haven't got time to go into detail in terms of other administrations?
So New Zealand, for example, have recognised the wastefulness in their fisheries, the lack of economic returns, the public perception of the fisheries. They cited all of those as reasons for adoption of full electronic monitoring in order to achieve full accountability for their catches. Yeah. And they see all of those as clear benefits for them as a country.
And other administrations?
So the US, for example, has now decided that they need to get a much better grip on being accountable. Again, some of the best. Australia, I think, is there as well.
Australia's been using cameras on their longline fleets for several years, and I think Canada has got a very good monitoring and reporting of their groundfish fishery. And
even some of our South American countries, Chile, Peru, are very progressive.
Okay, I've got three other people that want to come in. If I could ask people to be fairly brief. Lord Krebs.
Just very briefly on, Lord Chairman, the graph that you referred to, which is this one showing time along here, discards along there. I wondered if you knew whether this was simply what was reported, so this is an increase in underreporting, whether there's actually genuinely a reduction in discards.
I would say that there has been a genuine reduction in discarding over the last 5 to 10 years, certainly. But I am sure there would still be some underreported discarding.
How do we know if it's a matter of reporting with no checking? It links to the question about remote electronic monitoring. How will we know that it's an accurate report?
I think that's the issue at the moment. We just simply don't know because we have, less than 1% observer coverage in our fleet, so we have nothing to verify, or very little to verify catch reporting at the moment.
Good. Thank you. Viscount Oswald, you wanted to come in, I think? Or, no? Okay. Lord Hanworth, sorry.
Oh, yes, we've been told just recently that the quotas are sometimes very obtuse. For example, pollock migrate northwards and are only available in the winter, so the annual quota is inappropriate and it should be varied throughout the year. The other one we were told of was bass, which was once subject to a very stringent quota, is still subject to that quota, but is now there in abundance. Do you accept the aspersion that these quotas are being thoroughly ill-defined, and what could be done to get this right?
Well, I might start with bass. I think underpinning everything is good data, and bass is a good example of where we've got terrible data for the fishery. There's been a lot of attention on sea bass over the last sort of couple of years, and there's been large attempts to improve the data, but the margin of error is still very large in their stock assessments, and that's in part because we don't have good monitoring of catches and discards at sea, and also because a lot of recreational fishers access that fishery, and it's very difficult to monitor those catches. But yes, I guess fishery science is never perfect, and it's difficult to count the number of, or estimate the number of fish in any population. And I think fishers' data and their input is very important to help build an accurate picture of stock assessment. But better objective data and feeding into those assessments, I think, is one of the key ways to make them better. And once we have the best available science and the best opinion, I think we need to try to follow it.
You seem to be implying that recreational fishing has had a big impact. I mean, that's an interesting point, because we've been dealing with that issue just a moment ago. Can you reassert that?
It certainly is on some species. So pollock and bass, they're important recreational species, and there have been very strict restrictions on recreational fishing for bass over the last year or two.
We're going to come on to some of the choke issues and exemptions and flexibilities later on, perhaps where we can do some more on the quota side. Lord Young, you wanted to, before we move on?
Yeah. You'll say we need to check at sea to have any accurate idea of discard. So I was looking at the WWF document. We've just been interviewing fishermen who are sort of 10 metres and under. Is this a practical? That's question one. Is that a practical solution to them? And then the second question is, what about the cost of? At the moment, their selectivity apparatus appears to be net size. I mean, I may have got the wrong, but when I listened to them, that's what they were saying. It's if we regulate the size of the nets, that will solve the problem. I'm aware that New Zealand have got different approaches with tubes and various other things. So, do they need that as well as the REM?
So I think to your first question, in terms of practicality, so from a policy perspective, we've been advocating the adoption of electronic monitoring for the over 10 metre fleet, because that fleet represents 94% of the catch in weight and 88% in value. So it actually addresses a lot of the quota catch. For the under 10s, there are absolutely options. Some of it could be EM if any vessel is considered a higher risk for any particular purpose. So, for example, small gillnet vessels who may have an increased risk of harbour porpoise bycatch may be appropriate for EM monitoring. It's all applicable, but I guess it's about the scale of things. So the costing at the minute, we have looked at the costing for that over the over 10 metre fleet, and it comes in somewhere in the region of about £5 million for all of those vessels, which compares to an estimated running annual cost of current operation as usual for £20 million at the minute, which does not give us that eyes at sea. So for 100% of observer data, you could have it for a quarter of the cost, and you could do a bit of switching in and out of current, redeploy some of the current costs to make that happen. So it's very cost effective. I take your point in the under 10s. I think where appropriate, where identified, you could start looking at EM.
I think we're going to come on to enforcement later on. I think perhaps we could pursue the point further at that time. Duke of Montrose.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. The Lord Chairman has drawn our attention to the official decline in landing obligations that have taken place in bycatch landing. But we've just heard from fishermen their view on how the landing obligation has been implemented. What is your view on how the landing obligation has been implemented to date?
Well, I think both Sam and I, our respective organisations, share the view that we are disappointed. We think there has we've had 5 years, shall we say, from the point of announcing that the landings obligation came on the legislature, and in that 5-year period, we should have been putting in place quite a strategic plan as to how we work towards the phasing, because it was phased in, with the different fisheries, taking the pelagics as what was seen to be relatively low risk, and then sort of addressing the more challenging, and we're now at the most challenging point where we're taking those very mixed species fisheries. Certainly we feel that there should have been more planning in advance, more preparation, more support for the fishermen themselves, because we haven't, for example, taken good advantage of European Maritime Fisheries Fund, which we could have been doing throughout this whole period, because that was specifically one of the reasons cited for that EMF funding for this period, was to assist with the introduction of the landings obligation. So I'm afraid we don't feel that planning and preparation has been done to good effect, to a point now where we are looking at a landing obligation which is not being effectively implemented or monitored.
Sam, do you wish to make any comment? You don't need to.
Yeah, I think I would just add that I guess there are some positives. I would certainly agree with everything that Helen said at 100%. If I was to look at some of the positives, there have been a lot of trials to look at how selectivity can be improved and how discard ban might work in practice, but it doesn't seem like the outcomes of these trials have been adopted and taken forward. It just seems like that's the trial, and now we wait and see what happens. So I think it would have been nice to see some of these outcomes actually becoming commonplace and implemented in the fleets. And I guess a positive, I think to date I've been fairly pleased with the joint recommendations that have come out and the various exemptions and flexibilities that have been applied. I think they've been fairly well justified. So we're seeing exemptions granted to vessels where they, by and large, are implementing best practice selectivity measures and measures to improve post-capture survival.
Could I just follow up and say, who do you think could have drawn up a plan and who could have applied for funding?
So I think so depending on what sort of part of it. So if you were looking at, so Sam talked about testing, piloting certain types of gear. Absolutely right, that's happened, but if a particular gear type was seen to be effective, so for example in the mixed fisheries, there's been some really great ideas there could have been a joint proposal brought together with the regulators and the catching fleet and the monitoring people to pull together a proposal for an EMF funded project, put it together to help with that implementation. I mean, there's a range of options that I think have not been adequately explored, unfortunately.
Why do you think that's the case?
That's a difficult one.
I think there's been widespread, I guess, opposition to the policy to start with, and I don't think it was developed sufficiently or communicated well enough with the stakeholder, with the industry in particular, and even the member states. There have been a lot of questions that have remained unanswered for several years, and we're only just seeing some firm, concrete answers a few weeks before the full implementation. So I think a lot of agencies will play some part in not better promoting it and progressing it. But I think from industry to government agencies, even to NGOs, we probably all could have done more to emphasise the need to get
Is it
on
just
with
because everybody involved just thinks it's all too difficult and something will just turn up at the end of the day? Is that the impression you get?
It really is a reversal of fisheries management. Traditional fisheries management, it's really turning it on its head, and it's a very new approach, and it does need it takes a lot of effort to bring people along. It is designed to be a very big change in the way fisheries are managed, but a very big change is what's needed, and I think we've failed to get all stakeholders on board.
Okay.
And I think there is a view that certainly at a European level, I think there has been a view that, you know, perhaps if we keep our heads down, it might just not actually go ahead because it is so very difficult. And with Brexit, I think also there's been a possibility of, certainly from the UK, thinking, well, perhaps it's not going to be implemented, so is there really that hard deadline? But of course, as we're aware, there really is, and we've failed to address it, unfortunately.
Okay. Lord Young.
Yeah, we had a witness, I think he was the CEO of the Marine Management Organisation, and he talked about a cultural change, and he sort of adopted his view about enforcement was, look, we're asking them to do a very profound change. And the impression I got from him was that they're going to adopt a sort of pragmatic approach. Now, notwithstanding that it's the first time we've heard that they've had 5 years and they don't seem to have made as much progress as possible. Do you think is that the right attitude? Was that analysis reasonable in the circumstances?
So was he talking about taking a pragmatic approach in the 5 years to date or in the future?
Yeah. The application of discard and, yeah.
In terms of understanding where the landings obligation, if we actually want to move forward and shift the culture, as you say, everybody has to understand that we're serious about doing that. And I think the messages coming from regulators, administrators, need to be very serious about that. They need to be clear, this is going to happen, but we need to find a way to make that happen and bring the industry with us. But at the end of the day, I mean, I've been in conversations whereby industry have said, well, you know, I'm not going to be the guy who does, you know, takes the camera and I'm, you know, and nobody else is. And you can, you know, I can be an industry leader perhaps and start a role, but realistically, they're not going to. It needs to be something which a regulator just says, this is going to happen, but we're going to put in best plans, resources to support that happening and have a plan, a strategy, a timeline as to how that will happen in the best way that will support the industry through it, but actually have its clear implementation and operation in place at a set point.
Just remind members that we should not refer to private briefings that we've had as part of the committee. Lord Krebs.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I think you've already answered the question I was going to ask, which is how confident are you that the landing obligation will be effectively implemented from January 1st, 2019? I think the answer is you're not confident, but you may wish to elaborate on it. But further to that, when we asked the previous witness panel, and you were there at the end of it, what they think should happen, they favoured a more gradual implementation. So could you just give us your take on, if you're not confident it will be fully implemented on the 1st of January, which I assume you're not, what would you like to see happen?
To be blunt, no, I'm not confident at all that it will be fully implemented in a few weeks' time. But would be delighted if I'm proven wrong. But no, what we've seen to date, and I guess lack of visibility of any firm plans for monitoring and to roll out the discard ban in a few weeks, then certainly not confident. I think there is a lot that still can be done. Obviously, there's only a few weeks to go, but we would really like to see improved monitoring of catches. We would like to see uplift applied on the basis or to fleets who can demonstrate that they're genuinely trying to comply with the discard ban, and they can demonstrate that. They're employing best practice selectivity measures, and they may have cameras on board to help demonstrate that. I think there needs to be, I know there's already efforts domestically and internationally to help get quota to where it's needed within the sustainable catch limit, but that really needs to be ramped up. It seems like there's, as we heard earlier, in many cases quota is available, but it's just not getting to the places where it's needed because of complications with domestic trading and international trading, and we'd love to see that sorted out. Because the last thing we want to see is boats prevented from fishing, particularly where the stock is in a good condition. They're probably the key things that I'd like to see happen.
Yeah, and I think as I've outlined, we should have done that planning to date. We should have had that in place, but let's be very clear then from January 2019 that we have a very clear plan with timelines for phasing in an effective system, because in terms of achieving accountability of catch and therefore having effective monitoring at sea, it's not going to happen overnight, but it will not happen unless somebody actually takes the first step to preparing for it. So that would be our view in the very first instance, and then prioritise those vessels that you anticipate that have been identified as being medium, high or very high risk for potential infringements.
Thank you. Lord Cameron.
Yes. Thank you very much. Good morning. We now come to the problems, and by far the biggest problem is the whole question of choke species and that problem. And we've heard how fishermen fear that, if there are monthly quotas, they probably have to, they maybe stop from fishing after the first week of every month, or if they're on yearly quotas, have to stop fishing in March. And none of us would like to only receive a quarter of our salary, particularly if you've got the bank or the mortgage company breathing down your neck. So what do you think we can do about this question? What should the government, what should the fishermen, what should we, what should the European Union, what can we do to resolve the problem of the choke issue vis-à-vis this landing obligation?
Well, I think some of the things I was alluding to before need to be implemented as quickly as possible. So the quota, access to quota, particularly if there is a total allowable catch and there is quota available within that limit, governments need to make sure that it goes to the vessels that need it to implement the discard ban. So that's critical. We need to make sure we're using, to the extent that is legal and justifiable, all the exemptions and flexibilities available to governments within the basic regulation. So there are exemptions, and there are some which are a bit foggy, like interspecies flexibility, which haven't been really used, but there's potential for some of these flexibilities to be applied. The December Council is shortly coming up, and that's when catch limits will be agreed for next year. And I'm sure in some cases there will be a desire to set catch limits in a way that helps implement the discard ban. And whilst I think there may be a justification for doing that in some cases, we would just personally most worried about stocks which are already overfished or depleted, like west of Scotland cod and whiting and Celtic Sea cod. These are going to be very difficult chokes to sort out, and in those cases we would really like to see proper investment in avoidance measures and things like that. But it all has to happen very, very quickly.
And indeed, one of the solutions that we've raised is for stocks like west of Scotland cod, where there was a zero quota and the stock is in still a very poor state. We've suggested that actually, if those vessels who are operating in that fishery took electronic monitoring to really give us a true account of what is coming up, that starts to build the data for that stock, because that's one of the complaints around that stock, is that the data is not adequate, because we really don't have an understanding of what is coming out. So perhaps some leniency in as part of the adoption of electronic monitoring might be a way forward in some of those circumstances. But not to forget that we are talking about different types of choke, because there are three categories, category 1, 2 and 3, and 1 and 2 can be resolved with the UK, either domestically or within the sea basin that they're operating in, so with negotiations with other EU member states. It's those category 3 that there just aren't enough fish in the system, and those are the ones where we have to be more innovative and perhaps look at some of these solutions about, well, let's just find out exactly what's going on in the system, because that's what we're currently lacking, is real knowledge of what's coming out.
We were being told in the last session that certain mesh sizes were illegal in certain areas, and it seemed to me at the time that it would be far better to say to the fishermen, look, you decide on what the mesh size ought to be. It's your problem, so we should stop all that. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we take a very flexible approach to what's really important about the impact of how we fish is what are we removing from the sea, so that we can be accountable, whether that is a quota species or a non-quota species, and have some understanding about the impact of that. So if a fisherman is given a quota for X, then he or she is the best person to know how to remove that, and as long as they don't remove more than that. But we need to have that evidenced, and that's where we currently are lacking. We need to have better evidence of what is coming out, because not only is it, it's good for knowledge about what's coming out of the water, it's good for assessment, stock assessment, and therefore setting hard confidence in the quotas that we are setting being the right ones. So that's...
Okay. Sorry, Lord Cameron.
Thank you.
Perhaps I could ask Sam, if your Australian experience, I don't know whether they have mixed fisheries there or not, but I only have experience of New Zealand. But what can we learn something from that in terms of getting around these choke species issues?
Australia does have mixed fisheries, but I would say not on the same scale as Europe. I think we are in a relatively unique situation, to be honest, and the scale and scope of the discard ban is unique as well. Australia doesn't have a discard ban in place yet, so maybe we can't learn a great deal from that. But I do like the way they have encouraged the industry to develop their own solutions to selectivity and avoidance. So there's been a large investment in trials where fishermen are given the freedom and the flexibility to solve their own problems, and they're very good at problem solving. But it doesn't just end there. They look at the issue, they trial some potential solutions, they pick the best one, and then that actually gets rolled out throughout the wider fleet. And I think I'd like to see that more of that happening here.
Okay, just one very quick one as well. In terms of one of the papers that we've been looking at today in terms of our scrutiny function has where the Minister is saying in the negotiations that he's looking maybe not to worry so much about relative stability, but in terms of different catch measurements. Does relative stability sort of completely get in the way of the choke issue?
It does in some of the categories. I think that's fair to say. Yeah, in terms of where some of the member states have more of an allocation and than perhaps we would like to see, and reflects what's in our waters. So I think it's very dependent on the.
And that presumably will get worse with climate change and migration of species. Does it get potentially worse? You got all the wrong
who can
catch
say?
limits?
I mean, it's quite difficult to predict that sort of thing, because with shifts, north and south, and it's quite tricky.
That's fine. Thank you, Lord. You wanted to come in briefly. Then I need to move on.
Just on selectivity gear and apparatus, and you said there's trials going on. We heard something about New Zealand previously. Are any of those? Is any of that applicable or practical cost effective for British fleets?
We've had some great trials undertaken in UK waters. I mean, some really promising. So for mixed fishery in the northeast Atlantic, with taking advantage of the fact that different fish respond to nets differently. So had it go up, cod go down. So it means if you're trying to select out cod, you can select those out in that way. But again, while trials have been successful, there hasn't been the rollout or the adoption of those further afield than those vessels trialling them. And part of that is maybe money, but could be possibly addressed by EMFF. Part of it is is that where I invest my business plan? That's not something we can answer. But there certainly have been some very successful trials, and some vessels are. I mean, as Sam said, this has definitely incentivised greater selectivity, but possibly not across all vessels and to the extent that it possibly could go.
Okay, thank you. We could move on then to Lord Rooker.
Yeah, good morning. I want to ask you about exemptions, flexibilities, but before I do, I think as Chairman said, you're probably our fourth group of witnesses, and I'm new to this fishing area. I've always dealt with farming and everything else, but I just get the overall impression there's been no proper planning or preparation to prevent poor performance in the implementation of this policy, bearing in mind it was enunciated 4 or 5 years ago. So could I ask, have either of your organisations had or requested any meetings in the last 18 months with DEFRA ministers about what you must have perceived no action?
Yes, is the answer to that.
You've had the meetings?
Yes.
And the result of the approach, the attitude, acceptance of delay?
I think it's fair to say that with Brexit occurring in the last 2 years has slightly thrown, perhaps a certain focus, maybe not being quite as focused as it should be. So administrations both, bearing in mind that obviously this is a devolved matter largely, so we're talking about the UK and devolved administrations. Certainly there are different ways between the devolved administrations as to how they engage with their stakeholders as well. So in Scotland, for example, it's a much more there is much more stakeholder engagement and a sort of how are we going to address this together approach with the stakeholders than I have experienced with the English approach to it. That's one point where we've met, and so we've also had meetings with DEFRA in attendance with some of our corporate colleagues, retailers who are concerned about this and the potential for illegality in their supply chain come January 2019. So I think they're concerned as well. They're concerned about the officials are concerned about what's going to happen in January 2019 and the level of preparedness. But that's not to say that actually there is going to be...
Can I just Lord Rooker's raised a very interesting point there. Just to come back to the supply chain, which has been mentioned before. Do you think any of the retailers will insist, say, that there's electronic monitoring on vessels for them to be part of the supply chain? Is that the sort of pressure that might be put on?
So currently, we've been working with the likes of, basically the big retailers, and their view at the minute is, if they are challenged in their supply chain, do you have illegality in your supply chain? They have to be able to give an answer to that. So their view to DEFRA is, we need to see demonstrably legal fisheries. So demonstrably meaning unique. So going back to the catching sector and saying, okay, you're telling me there's no discarding going on because we have in place in legislature something that says you have to land everything. Can you demonstrate to me that that is what is happening? So those sorts of conversations are, maybe that they're taking place. I don't think they've gone to the point whereby they're saying we're not going to source from you. if you can't do that. But that pressure and that understanding of the pressure on them as to meet their corporate and social responsibilities in terms of legality in their supply chain are very, very real, and they need to be addressed. And so certainly those expressions have been made to both the catching sector and the administrations, and I think they've been heard. And EM is definitely something that they see as part of that solution, being able to demonstrate legality.
And Samuel, have you got your organisation a similar experience or not?
So we haven't been engaging the retailers on
No,
this,
the,
on this particular
it's the
issue.
ministers I'm after.
Yes, we've...
I'm not after the ministers, but it's the departments.
We've
No,
certainly...
we do that later.
We have brought these concerns to senior officials and the minister. And
What, Scotland and England?
Personally, England, and certainly officials in all administrations, and my colleagues probably. Yeah, I'm not sure personally about Scotland and Wales, but I'm sure the message has been communicated pretty clearly, and I think there is a recognition of that they share the concern, and I think there may have been a very large underestimation of the volume of work and effort and resources needed to properly do this, and I think they're realising that maybe too little, too late.
Yeah. It's called the failure of public administration in some quarters. The question I want to ask you, basically, I think it's superfluous, which was the one about exemptions, to ask you if you think the current exemptions and flexibilities within the obligation strike the right balance in terms of conservation and the fishermen. You can't answer that because you've got no confidence, you don't know what's going to happen, you think it won't happen, but on paper, the rules of exemptions and flexibilities that the MMO has put out, are they the right balance? Is there any key factor that you really want to go to the heart of it and say, well, that should have been better to start with, even before the implication of the implementation of this policy, which looks as though it's not going to operate anyway?
I would say that I think I share Sam's view in terms of the practical approach that's been taken to the flexibilities to date, and trying to find ways, to allow fishing to continue taking account of justifiable exemptions. I think that's been fairly done, but I would say that what we would have liked to have seen accompanying that was the eyes on the water, kind of.
Was what?
Going with the electronic monitoring, eyes on the water to
Okay.
find out how they've actually operated under practical implementation, so that, again, this is just about coming back to good management. You put in place an adjustment. So how does that change? Because it's not always the things that you think it might have an effect on. There are also unintended consequences. So is there something else that's affected by you doing X? And so it's that responsive management, which at the minute I don't think we have the technology and means in place to understand the consequences of what we're kind of doing at the minute. So
Helen, can I just ask one thing here? Because I think in your CV that you're a particular expert on survivability of species that are thrown back.
No, that wasn't me.
So have they got that right in terms of the species that can survive when they're sent back?
I think there's quite a broad sort of science sort of.
Sorry, did I mistake that?
I'm not a survivability expert.
I apologise.
I don't think so, no.
I saw that written down somewhere, that someone had done some work on the survivability of what was chucked out, but I'm not putting it on either of you, but I've read that.
Yes.
Tom Catchpole, maybe.
It could be, maybe Tom Catchpole, possibly.
Okay, anyway, we'll leave that then and move on to Baroness Wilcox.
What's been telling us, the environmental groups are concerned that the landing obligation is not being effectively enforced. So the question is, how effectively is the landing obligation currently being enforced? Can you give us sort of some
We're
feedback
expecting a
on
rather brief answer on this, I'm afraid.
yeah, I
but
can
over
see
to you.
that. I can see that. I was trying to encourage her.
To be blunt, it doesn't really seem like it's being enforced to date. There's evidence, there's consensus among member states and the European Fisheries Control Agency and various other agencies and stakeholders that there's been widespread non-compliance to date. But I think it's important to distinguish between monitoring and enforcement. Maybe we'll touch on it later, but enforcement always has a certain expectation. There's a punishment for infringements, and there is evidence that our current enforcement regime isn't strict enough. But for the discard ban, I'm most concerned with accurate monitoring, because if we lose a handle on what has been caught and thrown away, then we're going to skew stock assessments in the future and will undermine future management. So I do think that enforcement has to be fairly reasonable and really focus on those who are deliberately abusing the rules.
We'll come on to future enforcement in the next question.
But, I would echo Sam's point. I mean, it's really, we're not about criminalising people. What we're interested in seeing is, do we have an understanding of what's actually happening at sea? And at the minute we don't. And, I think there is a case for a bit of leniency on strict enforcement and criminalisation in return for, or rather in preference for, actually having that understanding and getting our stock assessments. Because at the minute, we think, well, there's a wide kind of acceptance that discard levels are occurring at similar and in some circumstances at higher rates than they have been previously, and that's exceedingly dangerous for our stocks, because it just means in reality we have overfishing. And we've done such great things in recent years about getting those stocks, building them up again, decreasing fishing mortality, and we're about to reverse all that if we don't get this right.
When you go around Europe, have you noticed any infrastructure being put up on the quayside to deal with the unwanted stock which will now have to be landed? Because that seems to me would be an indication that they're taking enforcement literally. But from what we've heard, I don't know that seems to be happening. I'm just wondering if you could give us any flavour of what might be happening in the rest of Europe. Shake your head.
Yes, that's similarly, because it was a big issue, certainly at the beginning of when the landings obligation first came in. We will need, so greater sort of icing facilities, places to actually deal with the fish that previously been discarded. But I think certainly here in the UK, those facilities, while some of them may have been put in place for receiving discarded fish, they haven't been used because the levels of discards have not been as such, because we think, or rather the levels of landings have not been as such, i.e. they have continued to be discarded at sea. So, yeah. But I don't know if you've heard any.
No, I would agree with all of that. I haven't travelled around Europe much, just to various ports to see firsthand, but I suspect it's a similar situation.
Okay. Utilka.
May I ask, what is your assessment of how prepared the United Kingdom government is to enforce the landing obligation when it applies to all fisheries in 2019? What more do you believe needs to be done to ensure compliance with the landing obligation? And are there lessons that the United Kingdom could learn from other countries on how to effectively monitor compliance at seas? So the two questions are really enforcing of landing obligations and also monitoring compliance at sea.
Yeah, so I think we've touched upon the fact that we don't think they're going to be prepared and ready come January 2019, because to adopt something like electronic monitoring, as I think I said before, it's not going to happen overnight. you know, you need to think about what kind of system you're going to put into place, what infrastructure you require to do that, actually get the technology onto the vessels, get the screens, and dockside, etc. So it's, you know, it takes quite a bit of timing and planning, and none of that is in play as far as we're aware at present. And we do think that is where we need to get to, so that, you know, particularly as the UK is about to exit the European system and go out into that very competitive global seafood market, you know, we should be able to market ourselves as high sustainability, high value fisheries, that strong reputation for sustainable fisheries. And it's with the support of something like electronic monitoring that says we have the confidence on the water to be able to make those claims. And we think we're missing, well, we know we're missing that trick, but we need to see some evidence of that intention, because until we do, we will continue to have a lack of understanding of what's happening at sea, what the impacts are in our stocks, and potential overfishing, which would be a catastrophe.
Can I just ask, how long do you think it will take to get an electronic monitoring scheme in place which is acceptable? I mean, would you, for example, consider a pilot scheme, or would you go for the whole?
So I don't think there's a need to pilot it. We've around the world, technology is moving very quickly, and indeed here in the UK we have some English vessels are operating very happily with camera technology, and indeed some Scottish vessels have done to date. I don't think there are any just now who are, and indeed governments have, you know, said they're willing to look at put it into place. So I don't think pilots are required. We have talked about the over 10 metre fleet. That's somewhere in the region of 1,300 vessels. It's not insurmountable to look at perhaps rolling it out at that scale. If you did need to prioritise further, you may start to look at that medium, high risk, very high risk, take those as the first out the door, if you like. But, you know, it depends how much resources you're willing to put into it. If you get a goodly amount of money, get the people who supply the technology and are able to actually physically go out and wire it all up, you know, you could be talking within a year, possibly, but possibly longer if you don't put the adequate resources into it, I would say.
Thank you.
Look, Krebs.
Thank you, Roger. If I could just follow up on the last point. As you're aware, we just had a witness panel representing under 10 metre fishermen, which is 80% of the UK fleet, roughly speaking. And if I slightly paraphrase and maybe exaggerate what they said, was that they said, well, we, the small fishermen, one of them used the phrase artisanal fishermen, are very careful and we manage our stock sustainably. In any case, we couldn't afford and we haven't got the space on our boats to have remote electronic monitoring. Therefore, the real villains are the bigger boats who are not harvesting fish sustainably and can afford and have the space to put remote electronic monitoring. Do you, from where you sit, think there is a difference in the attitude towards sustainable fishing between small and large boats, under 10 metres, and the bigger boats?
I think, I don't know if there's a difference in attitude per se. I think most fishermen that we meet are very supportive of fishing sustainably, but I guess that's subjective. In terms of putting cameras on vessels and whether or not they should be applied to all under 10 metre vessels, I think over 10 metres they're responsible for the greatest share of the catch, and then under 10s, as I think Helen alluded to, I think we'd be looking for the greatest risk. So some of those vessels are static gear and probably quite low risk of breaking the rules, but some of them are mobile gears and could be at more risk of non-compliance with the discard ban or other measures, and might therefore be a good candidate to get cameras on board.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say that these camera systems can be applied to many vessel sizes. So, you know, even under 10 metre vessels, it's absolutely applicable. And in terms of the costings, you know, perhaps for smaller operators, you have greater sort of government assistance with that. But there are other, I think what's important is, again, coming back to the accountability of what we're removing from the system. As you say, 80% of the fleet are those under 10 vessels. So it is important that we understand what is being removed from a range of fisheries so that we have that kind of ecosystem-based approach to our fisheries management. And there are alternatives to necessarily having a camera in all instances. So it would be a case of, you know, having the right and appropriate technology for each situation, I think.
Given that we've had these pilot sort of actually maybe with as if it was there was a landing obligation, how much can we just use data so that in future, so that when things are landed, what the actual proportion of fish, of species, how much that is like, if you like, we would expect it to be. How much will data come into importance in terms of enforcement? I mean, that because that's how we look at a lot of things, isn't it, these days? And if it doesn't comply with the sort of the ratios we expect of species, or in relation to where the vessel has been, then is that a means of enforcement, or is that do we not have sufficient data to do that?
So that's been where we've kind of operated historically, whereby you would have a broad understanding of, with this particular gear type operating this kind of quota mix in this particular sea area, we would expect X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And things that deviate from that, you start to go, okay, let's look at this more closely. With the landings obligation, we obviously, the intention was that you move to more selectivity. So your discarding will change in its dynamic, because you're maybe discarding more undersized fish, for example, because you've moved to bigger mesh sizes, or you've managed to select out cod by splitting your net. So I think using historical data is going to be difficult, because we should have shifted through to more selective gear, and getting an understanding of what the associated discards are with that gear configuration, wherever it is very important. And again, it just comes back to, well, let's just see what's happening. And, you know, so if we were to run, for example, a year-long assessment of, okay, if you put in the most selective gear that you think you can deal with for your particular quota mix, let's see what happens. And that's what's not happened to date, and I think that, you know, would be very informative. Okay, just to tie the session up, can I just ask then a question that effectively Lord Krebs asked in the previous session? Given this, all the problems we've got at the moment, I think everybody's said, even the industry, that a landing obligation is good. Have we got the wrong landing obligation here under EU legislation? And I was going to say post-Brexit, but whether Brexit happens or not, as the Prime Minister is saying, if we're post-Brexit, is there a much better landing obligation that we could have in the UK?
It's hard to know, but I would suggest that the existing discard ban, as written in the basic regulation, in an ideal world, could have been developed with maybe greater flexibility or recognition of sort of region, maybe with greater input from the specific regions. So I think it could have been better, but I guess it remains to be seen whether or not it's fully workable. I don't think we're 100% satisfied that we've exhausted every opportunity to really implement it. I'm not confident that that's the case anyway. So,
you think this one could be made to work?
Well, I'm not confident. I'm not 100% confident that it won't work, but there are obviously some very real challenges still to overcome, and we only have a few weeks left. So the stocks where there is a zero catch, that's been advised, how the discard ban will overcome, will not choke fisheries in these cases, will be very, very challenging. So yeah, I would agree that it's going to be difficult, but and in hindsight, maybe they could have incorporated some greater flexibility, but that's, I guess, the benefit of hindsight.
Okay, thank you. Helen?
We are where we are, and we've put this into place, and people have an understanding of what it means, and we have started down the line to try to address what it means and implement it effectively. And I think with greater resources and greater collaboration, it could be delivered with the right support in place. And I consider EM as a key part of that. I think it could be made to work. I think if you start changing it now, you may enter into less clarity, more confusion, and less impact at the end of the day.
Okay. Thank you very much, both of you, for your evidence. We very much appreciate your input. Please, if there's anything else you want to tell us, let us know. And I bring this public evidence session to an end. Thank you.